Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Language Unlocked, the podcast where we dive into the challenges and triumphs of learning and using new languages. I'm Maya, your host.
And I'm Arjun, co-host and your language learning enthusiast. Today, we've got an interesting topic that a lot of you might relate to. Understanding English, but struggling to speak it. We'll share experiences, tips, and some personal stories. So let's get into it.
Part 1. The struggle of understanding but not speaking.
So, Arjun, I've had so many friends tell me that they understand English perfectly well. They watch movies, read books, and even think in English. But when it comes to speaking, they just freeze up. Have you ever experienced that?
Oh, totally. I think it's a common issue. It's like your brain gets it, but your mouth just can't keep up. For me, it was like that with Spanish when I first started learning. I could understand conversations, but speaking? That was a different story.
I think it's because speaking is so much more than just understanding the words. It's about confidence, fluency, and also the fear of making mistakes. It can be pretty intimidating to try and speak a language, especially if you're not used to it.
Exactly, and it's not just about the vocabulary or grammar. It's also the pronunciation, the accent, the flow of sentences. It's like there's a gap between what you know and what you can actually produce.
Yeah, it's almost like your brain is on a different wavelength. You can follow along with a TV show, for example, but when someone asks you a question in English, you're like, wait, what?
Exactly, and it's frustrating because you know you understand it. It's not that you don't know what to say, but it's like your tongue and your brain aren't cooperating.
So, let's talk about why this happens. I mean, it's not just about being shy or nervous. There's more to it, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think a big part of it is how our brains process language. When you're learning a new language, your brain first builds the ability to recognize and understand it. Speaking, though, requires a different set of skills. It's more about production, which is a more complex process.
That makes sense. It's like the difference between recognizing a face and being able to draw it. One is passive, the other is active.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of muscle memory. Speaking a language involves training your mouth, your tongue, your vocal cords to make sounds that might not even exist in your native language. That takes time and practice.
And let's not forget about the psychological aspect. Fear of judgment, fear of making mistakes, these can all hold you back from actually trying to speak.
Yeah, the fear of making mistakes is huge. A lot of people think they have to speak perfectly, but that's not true. Perfectionism can be a big barrier.
I agree. It's okay to make mistakes. That's how you learn. But I think culturally, many of us are taught to avoid mistakes, especially in something as public as speaking.
Definitely, and the fear of sounding silly or not being understood can be really paralyzing.
Part 3. Breaking the barrier.
So, how do we get over this hurdle? What are some ways to go from understanding English to actually speaking it confidently?
I think the first step is practice. Just like with anything else, the more you practice, the better you get. You can start small, like talking to yourself in English, or practicing with a friend who is patient and supportive.
I love the idea of talking to yourself. It's like a no-pressure way to practice. Plus, you can really focus on how you're forming the words and sentences without worrying about anyone else.
Yeah, it's a great way to build confidence. Another tip is to immerse yourself in the language as much as possible. Listen to podcasts, watch movies, read books, all in English. The more you surround yourself with the language, the more natural it becomes.
That's so true. It's like you're training your brain to think in English, which makes speaking it a bit easier. And I think it's also important to find a speaking partner, someone who's either a native speaker or someone else who's learning.
Definitely. Having a conversation partner can be really helpful. It gives you the chance to practice in a real-world setting, but hopefully in a supportive environment where you don't feel judged.
And another thing is to focus on fluency rather than accuracy at first. Don't worry about making mistakes. Just try to keep the conversation flowing. The more you speak, the more natural it becomes.
Yeah, and over time, your accuracy will improve naturally as you get more comfortable with the language.
What about you, Arjun? What helped you when you were learning to speak Spanish?
For me, it was all about lowering the stakes. I started by practicing with friends who were either native speakers or fluent. They were super patient, and that made a huge difference. Also, doing things like ordering food in Spanish or asking for directions, real-life situations, really helped boost my confidence.
That's a great point. Sometimes we forget that language is meant for communication, not just perfection. The goal is to get your point across, even if it's not flawless.
Part 4, real-life scenarios.
Let's talk about some real-life scenarios where people might feel stuck. Like, for example, what should someone do if they're in a situation where they have to speak English, but they're nervous?
That's a good one. I think in those moments, it's important to remind yourself that the other person is probably more focused on understanding you than judging your English. Most people are pretty patient and understanding.
Absolutely. And if you get stuck on a word, try to describe it in simpler terms or use hand gestures. Communication is about getting the message across, not necessarily using the perfect word.
Right, and another tip is to have a few phrases ready that you're comfortable with, like, "I'm still learning English, could you speak a little slower?" Or, "Could you repeat that, please?" That way, you can buy yourself a little time if you're feeling overwhelmed.
I love that. It's like having a safety net, and I think people really appreciate it when you're honest about where you are in your language journey.
For sure, and it's okay to ask for help. People are usually happy to help if they know you're trying.
And let's not forget humor. If you make a mistake, laugh it off. It shows confidence and helps lighten the mood. Plus, it makes the interaction more memorable in a positive way.
Totally agree. Humor can be a great way to ease tension and make the conversation more enjoyable.
Part 5, encouragement and motivation.
So, for anyone listening who feels like they're stuck in this place of understanding but not speaking, what advice would you give them?
I would say, don't be too hard on yourself. Language learning is a journey, and everyone's pace is different. Celebrate the fact that you understand English. That's a huge accomplishment on its own.
Definitely. And remember, the goal isn't perfection, it's progress. Every time you speak, even if it's just a little bit, you're making progress.
Exactly, and surround yourself with positive influences. Find a community, whether it's online or in person, where you can practice without fear of judgment.
And take advantage of technology. There are so many apps, websites, and resources that can help you practice speaking English. Use them to your advantage.
And most importantly, be patient with yourself. Learning to speak a language takes time, and it's okay if it doesn't happen overnight.
That's such good advice. Language learning is a marathon, not a sprint. And with every step, you're getting closer to your goal. That's such good advice. Language learning is a marathon, not a sprint. And with every step, you're getting closer to your goal.
Absolutely, just keep going, and remember, you're not alone in this. There are so many people out there going through the same thing, and we're all in this together.
Part 6, listener Q&A.
So, we asked our listeners to send in some questions about this topic, and we've got a few good ones here. Ready, Arjun?
Let's do it.
All right. Our first question comes from Sarah in Mumbai. She asks, I can understand English when I read it, but when I try to speak, I feel like I can't find the words. What can I do to improve?
Great question, Sarah. I'd say one of the best things you can do is start practicing speaking regularly, even if it's just a little bit each day. Try summarizing what you read in English out loud or with a friend. This helps bridge the gap between understanding and speaking.
And don't worry if it's slow at first. It's all about building that muscle memory. The more you practice, the easier it will get to find the words when you need them.
Exactly. Another tip is to practice speaking on topics you're passionate about or familiar with. That way, you're less focused on finding the right words and more on sharing your thoughts.
Great advice. Our next question is from Ravi in Delhi. He says, I feel embarrassed speaking English in front of others because I think they'll judge me. How can I get over this?
Ravi, you're definitely not alone in feeling this way. It's natural to worry about what others might think, but it's important to remember that most people aren't judging you as harshly as you might think. They're probably just happy to see you trying.
Right. And think about it this way. By speaking English, you're doing something brave. Most people will respect you for that, not judge you.
And try to focus on the message you're trying to convey rather than how you're saying it. The more you practice, the more confident you'll become, and the less you'll worry about judgment.
Exactly. And if you can, find a supportive group of people to practice with. Having that positive environment can make a huge difference.
Great point, Maya. Our last question is from Ahmed in Cairo. He asks, what's the best way to improve my English speaking skills when I don't have anyone to practice with?
That's a tough one, but not impossible. If you don't have someone to practice with in person, you can use language exchange apps to find a practice partner online. Or try recording yourself speaking on different topics and then listen back to see where you can improve.
Yes, and you can also practice by reading aloud, watching English shows and repeating after the characters, or even joining online communities where you can interact in English.
And don't forget about social media. Platforms like Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube have tons of English-speaking communities where you can practice and learn.
Definitely. There are so many resources out there. You just need to find what works best for you.
Part 7. Overcoming common challenges.
You know, one thing we didn't touch on yet is how to deal with the plateau effect. Have you ever hit a point, Arjun, where you feel like you're not making any progress, even though you're practicing regularly?
Oh, definitely. It can be really frustrating when you feel like you're stuck in the same place, no matter how much effort you're putting in. I've experienced that with Spanish, where I reached a level of basic fluency, but then it felt like I wasn't improving any further.
Yeah, that plateau can be tough. I think it's common for learners at all levels. Sometimes, when you've mastered the basics, it becomes harder to notice progress because the improvements are more subtle.
Exactly. And it's easy to get discouraged when you're not seeing big leaps in your abilities. But I think the key is to change up your learning routine. Try something new, like a different type of practice, or even a new challenge.
That's a great point. Sometimes you need to push yourself out of your comfort zone to keep improving. Maybe try having more complex conversations or even diving into topics that are outside your usual interests.
Yeah, and you can also focus on specific skills. For example, if you're good at understanding but struggle with pronunciation, spend more time working on that. You could even take online pronunciation courses or work with a language coach.
Absolutely. And don't forget to celebrate the small victories. It's important to recognize that even small improvements are still progress. It helps to keep you motivated and positive.
Part 8. Cultural influences on language learning.
Another thing I've noticed is how cultural background can influence how comfortable someone feels speaking English. Have you noticed that too, Arjun?
Definitely. Cultural norms around communication can play a huge role. In some cultures, there's a lot of emphasis on speaking correctly and politely, which can make people more nervous about making mistakes in a new language like English.
That's so true. I've met people from cultures where they're taught to be really precise with their words, and that can make them more hesitant to speak English if they're not confident in their accuracy.
And then there are cultures where group harmony is really important. So people might be more hesitant to speak up in English if they're not sure they'll be understood. They don't want to disrupt the flow of conversation or make others uncomfortable.
Right. And in some cultures, there's also a strong emphasis on respecting elders or authority figures, which can add pressure when speaking English in a formal setting.
That's a good point. It's important to be aware of these cultural influences because they can add layers of complexity to the challenge of speaking English. Understanding these can help you be more compassionate with yourself and others during the learning process.
Absolutely. And I think it's also helpful to find cultural elements of English-speaking countries that resonate with you. Whether it's through movies, music, or literature, connecting with the culture can make the language feel more accessible and less intimidating.
That's a great idea. The more you can relate to the culture, the more natural it will feel to use the language. Plus, it makes the learning process more enjoyable.
Part 9. Building confidence through community.
Let's talk a bit more about the importance of community in language learning. We touched on it earlier, but I think it's worth diving deeper into how surrounding yourself with the right people can make a big difference.
Definitely. Having a supportive community can be a game changer. Whether it's a language learning group, a class, or even just a friend who's also learning. Having people around you who understand your struggles and successes can really boost your confidence.
Yeah, it's so much easier to practice and improve when you know you're not alone. Plus, being part of a community can provide you with opportunities to use the language in real-life situations, which is invaluable.
Absolutely. And communities can offer more than just practice. They can also provide emotional support. When you're feeling frustrated or stuck, it helps to talk to others who've been there and can offer encouragement or advice.
For sure. And let's not forget the power of language exchange communities online. There are so many platforms where you can connect with native speakers who want to learn your language in exchange. It's a win-win.
Yes, those are fantastic. They not only give you a chance to practice, but also to learn about different cultures, which can be really enriching.
And speaking with native speakers is such a great way to pick up on the nuances of the language, like idioms, slang, and even humor, which you might not get from a textbook.
Exactly. It also helps you get used to different accents and speaking styles, which is important for real-world communication.
Part 10. The role of mindset in language learning.
One thing we haven't really touched on yet is the importance of mindset in language learning. How you think about the process can really impact your progress, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Your mindset can either be your biggest asset or your biggest obstacle. If you have a growth mindset where you believe that your abilities can improve with effort, you're more likely to keep going, even when things get tough.
That's so true. I've seen it in myself and others. When you're open to making mistakes and see them as learning opportunities rather than failures, it completely changes your experience.
Exactly. And it's also about being patient with yourself. Language learning is a marathon, not a sprint. If you're too focused on immediate results, you might get discouraged when progress is slow. But if you focus on the journey, every step forward feels like a win.
I love that perspective. And it's also important to set realistic goals. Instead of aiming for perfect fluency overnight, set smaller, achievable milestones that you can celebrate along the way.
Yes, and it's okay to take breaks when you need them. Sometimes stepping away for a bit and coming back with fresh energy can make a big difference in how you approach learning.
And surrounding yourself with positivity, whether it's through motivational content, connecting with encouraging people, or reminding yourself of why you're learning, can really help keep you on track.
Definitely. It's all about building a mindset that supports your learning journey, not hinders it.
Part 11. Practical exercises and tips.
Before we wrap up, let's give our listeners some practical exercises they can try to improve their English speaking skills. What do you think, Arjun?
Great idea. One exercise I really like is the shadowing technique. You listen to a native speaker, like on a podcast or in a movie, and try to mimic their speech as closely as possible. It helps with pronunciation, rhythm, and intonation.
That's a fantastic exercise. Another one is recording yourself speaking on different topics. Then listen back and critique your own pronunciation and fluency. It can be a bit uncomfortable at first, but it's a great way to identify areas for improvement.
Definitely. And how about practicing with flashcards, but for speaking? You can write down different scenarios or topics on each card, and then practice talking about them for a minute or two. It's a good way to build your spontaneous speaking skills.
I love that idea. It's like a speaking drill. Another tip is to use apps that focus on speaking and pronunciation. There are several that allow you to have virtual conversations or even give you feedback on your pronunciation.
Yes, and don't forget about language meetups or speaking clubs, whether they're online or in person. Those can be really valuable for getting real-time practice with other learners or native speakers.
Absolutely. The key is to practice regularly and in a variety of ways. The more diverse your practice, the better your overall skills will become.
Part 12. Final thoughts and wrap-up.
Well, Arjun, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. From understanding the challenges of speaking English to offering practical tips and exercises, we've given our listeners a lot to think about.
Yeah, this has been a really insightful conversation. I hope our listeners feel encouraged and equipped to tackle their English-speaking challenges.
Me too. And remember, everyone, learning a language is a journey. It's okay to stumble and make mistakes along the way. The important thing is to keep going, keep practicing, and stay positive.
Absolutely, and don't forget to celebrate your progress, no matter how small it may seem. Every step forward is a success.
We'd love to hear your thoughts and any strategies you found helpful in your own language learning journey. Feel free to share them with us on social media or through our website.
And if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to help you on your language journey.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Language Unlocked. We hope you found it helpful and inspiring.
And remember, language is not just about words, it's about connection, expression, and understanding. Keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.
Until the next time, take care and keep speaking.